Hey, Mel, you just can't stay away. You just got so much going on the Dome of the Rock. now, folks, hold on. We've looked at the inscriptions. We've asked questions about also the dating. We've asked questions about when it was put together, who is responsible. We're going to now hit something that I think is one of the most powerful arguments for a late date for the Dome of the Rock and certainly these ambulatories. And it has to do with, I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm going to let Mel really spill it because this is his material. This is his forte. But when you hear what he's going to show you, wait till you see, because he's going to prove that just by looking at another part of the dome, we can pretty well know that this could not have come from 691 because of how sophisticated it is. What am I talking about? You're going to have to ask Mel. Mel, go ahead. Help us here. What are we looking at, and what is it you're going to introduce?
Well, Jay, it's all about the mosaics, and I should point out at the beginning that I shouldn't take any credit for this. This is from A.J. Juice's paper,
yeah,
the Jewish serpent, so I don't take any credit for that. But the key thing about the mosaics is that if we look at contemporary mosaics just prior to the time of 691, and then we look at the decades afterwards, what we see is that the artwork, the mosaics of the time was much more primitive. And yes, somehow the artwork, the mosaics in the Dome of the Rock is apparently centuries ahead of its time. That should raise red flags straight off, and it would suggest that we're not dealing with the 7th century here, we're dealing with something else. Now, I have visited Pompeii years ago, and I'm well aware of how sophisticated the Romans were in terms of mosaics. So this is not some form of chauvinism towards the past. People in the past were well capable of doing sophisticated mosaics. But craftsmanship goes through cycles. Sometimes you have craftsmanship gets really excellent for a certain period of time, and then it kind of goes into remission. What we're expected to believe is that in the decades before the Dome of the Rock was supposedly built, everything was really primitive, and then just during the time the Dome of the Rock was put up, it became centuries ahead of its time. And then at the time of the caliphs of the 8th century, we saw some examples of their artwork inside their palaces. And one of the comments was that some of the artwork looked like it was drawn by 7-year-olds, very primitive indeed. So that's where we're going. I'll just put up the slide here, go from there. Now, so this picture here, it's from A.J. Juice's paper. You can see at the top of the inscription, the famous 20-meter long inscription. Underneath the inscriptions are motifs supposedly created at a time when Islam was still in formation. But if you look at the motifs there, that is anything but primitive. It's very sophisticated. At first glance, you might think, well, that's just a flowery decoration, but actually each little segment of the image has got symbolism and meaning that if you knew what was behind it, you'd actually work out the message behind it. It was actually very sophisticated. But the problem is that we wouldn't expect the symbolism to be this fully evolved at such an early time. You'd expect this to come centuries later, after a certain length of time when Islam has had a chance to self-reflect and think about what it means to itself, not in the first decades of its supposed existence, if you accept the standard Islamic narrative. So what A.J. Juice suggests is that the mosaics are artistically anachronistic. He says, likewise, the mosaics covering the inside seem artistically ahead of their time compared to the frescoes in Qasr Amra, a Umayyad palace from 30 years later. The frescoes still depict humans and animals. This is an inexplicable reversal of the guidelines for iconography that was supposedly ordered by Abdul al-Malik. If we take this very famous piece of Christian artwork and compare it, we'd see it's very primitive. A.J. Juice says the quality of Christian mosaics of the period are as far apart from those in the Dome of the Rock as early matrix printers from modern laser machines. The 6th century mosaic map from Madaba is crude. It was created around 570 AD. The artists appear to have had difficulties with simple scripts and curves. It is more akin to a crude sketch, absent of any details, care, or thought. He terms it cheap, worthless, and sloppy. This is anything like what we find in the Dome of the Rock, where it is very fine and very well executed. So he goes on to say that in contrast, the mosaics and inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock are smooth and elegant, full of details that are thoughtful and lavishly executed. The frescoes in Qasr Amra are likewise generations behind the artistic level in the Dome of the Rock. So even in the early part of the 8th century, in the Qasr Amra, it's still centuries behind what we find in the Dome of the Rock. This is very fishy indeed. So we kind of have to plead a special case why the caliphs couldn't manage to produce something comparable to what is found in the Dome of the Rock. That would suggest that we're not dealing with the 7th century here. We're dealing with mosaics that have been created at a much later time. The artistry on display in the Dome of the Rock was unlikely to come from the 7th century. The mosaics in the Dome of the Rock are centuries ahead of the style of Abdul al-Malik's time. The 7th century is also a global cultural, artistical, intellectual, financial, and political low point. Artisans of such abilities would have been few and far in between anywhere in the known world. If they were produced at that time, then there must have existed a large Syrian mosaic shop that had independently developed its own distinctive character, far ahead of all others. After the completion of these mosaics, the shop must have vanished back to whence it came without leaving another trace. Again, this is too hard to accept and believe that this was just a one-off in the 690s, and yet there are no other signs of these really avant-garde artisans from supposedly the latter end of the 7th century. And actually, just on that, I don't know if you want to react to that, Jay?
No, I mean, I'm sitting here and this is the first time I'm hearing it. I'm sure like almost all of the others who are listening, to me, this is like a slam dunk because what you're saying is, and we've always asked this, always go back to the 7th century. You've gone back to the 7th century. A.J. Deuce has done this. He's gone back to the 7th century. And he's saying, listen, something as simple as these motifs, I should say, they're on these mosaics. So beautiful, as we've seen in the picture you had there. Here, let's show it again. Here's the picture again. You can see that this is gorgeous. Look how sophisticated it is. Now let's look at what we do know from the 7th century. And I didn't know that it was at a low point. I had no idea, artistically, intellectually, financially, and politically, that it was at a low point in the 7th century. So if that is the case, you're right. It looks like that somebody somewhere was standing separate from all the rest and was pulled out of obscurity, did his beauty, and then went back into obscurity again. That doesn't make sense. We don't see that supported anywhere else. I don't see that evidenced anywhere else. And I would suggest that this is a pretty clear, cut and dried proof that this comes from a later date.
And what's interesting, and this will be something I will deal with in a later episode, is that if you compare the mosaics with the mausoleum of Suleiman, Caliph Suleiman, in the 16th century, you see a very close parallel between the mosaics in the Dome of the Rock and the mosaics in the clearly 16th century mausoleum of Suleiman.
That's 800 years later. So you're talking about this actually resembles what came into being, what would have been normal in 800 years later, not even 100 or 200 years later. You're talking about 800 years later.
Yeah. So, I think the clear, easiest explanation is that the mosaics are more likely to have been created in the 16th century rather than the 7th century. If you're going to support the 7th century creation of them, you've got a lot of problems to account for the mismatch with all of the other artwork. You're going to have to build a case why this just happened, and also take into account the fact that, as we saw in the last episode, there were multiple earthquakes with domes collapsing and so forth, and yet all of this beautiful mosaics that would have been difficult to make in the first place somehow is in pristine condition, not a tile out place. Everything's just perfect. And I imagine if they did get damaged or destroyed, it would be practically impossible to recreate what would have been there originally. You would have to start from scratch. So that's, part of the problem with this. Now, there's also one other detail about this that also adds to the case, is that there's an observation by Marcus Milwright that A.J. Juice references. He says, the modern expert in medieval Islamic art and archaeology, Marcus Milwright, made a stunning observation in his book about the Dome of the Rock. They were, in all likelihood, laid by craftsmen whose principal language was not Arabic. Now, how damning is that? A.J. Juice suggests that there were only two times when that would have been the case. Number one, the Crusades, and the second would be the Ottomans. Given the choice, I would hazard a guess that the Ottomans would have been the time frame when this would be most likely. I don't imagine the Crusaders would have had any interest in making those mosaics.
No. Why would you put something into a structure that was foreign to them and did not support their beliefs? If for the same reason that you said in the last episode, it looks like the inscriptions are written at a later date. We were asking for the dating of this. If the only other time when this would have been the case would be the Ottoman Empire, you're talking about at least from the 14th century and later. So we're looking at 14th, 15th, maybe even 16th century. This is starting to make it more specific because of the artistry. So that would, I'm not going to put a date. I know you're going to be putting a date later on, but we're already starting to narrow it down little by little.
Absolutely. And then just to wrap up our episode today, A.J. Juice kind of states the obvious, which is, which forger would make his fraud so obvious? So I'm going to read this in at length because it's so hard hitting. He says the dedication at the Dome of the Rock is taken as a fraud because the tiles did not match. He had to squeeze his dedication, Abdul Allah, the Imam al-Mamun, into the previous space, and he omitted to also alter the year of construction, 691 AD. He says, pardon me, I wonder which forger might make his fraud so obvious. Due to sustained damage of the mosaics during many earthquakes, they must have been repaired and restored many times over the centuries. But this is the evidence that al-Mamun committed a fraud to take credit for a building that he did not erect. The signature of al-Mamun is another clue that the inscription may date from much later, so much so that those who applied it carelessly were confused about who may have ruled the caliphate at the time of the dome's construction. The correction might have arisen because of such confusion. So now I don't know if I would go as far as to call this a fraud, but what seems to be happening is that the correction to the inscription may have been because the original inscription was already way later than the 7th and 8th century, at a time when the people making the inscription were not clear about who actually built the Dome of the Rock originally, and they decided to put Abdul al-Malik's name in, and then centuries later changed their mind and put in al-Mamun because maybe they thought, well, Abdul al-Malik might have been too early, and then they left it be. And by that stage, we're talking about, well, I better not give you the date because, let's keep that as a surprise. But there it lies. There it's now visible to the world to see. They can't do anything about it now, but there was a time where they could put up inscriptions and then change them and edit them and revise them before the world at large could take note of these changes. So that's it for me today. I'll come back to you now.
Okay, this is what you have done here is what we ask everybody to do. Paleography, the whole art, the whole paleographical study is doing what you just did here. When you look at a manuscript, for instance, and you look at the illustrations that are on sometimes in between verses or along the sides, along the margins, those illustrations usually depict a building, or they depict a structure, or they depict a design that is in a building. So, and that would be how the author of that particular text would then date when the text was written, and rather than write it in a date, they would put that beautiful building and they stick the mosaic or the design there, and that's how paleography works. Paleographist would use those to then date the manuscript. You've done the same thing with the building here. You've done the other way around. So you've looked at the building itself and say, I want to find a date here. So therefore, I've got to find something that will give me a window into when either a writing in the inscription that you've done above with the last episode, or now the mosaics, the motifs that are on the mosaics. Let's see if we can start finding dates when that type of mosaic would have existed by looking at other mosaics, which existed 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, all the way up. They're mosaics from the Roman periods, from the 2nd century. And so if you go to Ephesus, you'll see mosaics there. I've been there. I've seen them from the early periods of Christianity. So mosaics are beautiful because they do change. They are crude to begin with. They get more sophisticated and they get symbolic. And there's lots of symbolism in there. And by looking at the mosaics, we can then date the building. And you're doing that right here, or I should say AJ Dios is doing that right here. And that's why it's so important that we're not just looking at the inscriptions. We're not just looking also at the dome itself. We're looking at the mosaics, the motifs that are there. And we're pointing to the fact that this could be even 800 years later. Well, we're starting to get closer to a date that you're going to come up with. And this is what we've asked you to do. Thank you so much. What it does tell us clearly is that those ambulatories where the mosaics are, they're right above the columns. They're the top part of the columns. So the column comes out and they spread out to hold up the mantles for which the inscriptions are written on. They're all part of one piece. And obviously, these could not have come from 691 because nobody had that kind of sophistication in mosaics that early. Unless, of course, there was some genius that they might manage to find somewhere, and then they threw them into obscurity. But that's not the case here. It looks like this is what was quite well known at the time when this was made. Okay, terrific. You really whetted my appetite. I love this episode. Let's see what others think. Now, you people, comment, see what you say. Are you starting to get convinced? I'm starting to get convinced. Let's see if you are. Write in the comments down below. Terrific having you again, Mel. Thanks for coming on board. Listen, until the next time, what are you going to do next? What's the next thing you're going to hit us with?
I'm going to be talking about even more dramatic changes to the dome, more earthquakes, more fires, lots of changes.
Okay, there we go. From his mouth to your ears. Okay, Mel, thank you so much. And for the rest of you, this is Mel and Jay, 3,000 miles apart. Over and out.